I don't know if this will work this time. Nope. All right, we're going to skip the video. Sorry, you can watch it at home. Is the midterm content cut off after today? Well, the midterm's not till next Friday, so no. As soon as we're done globalization, then it'll be done. We should get through it by the end of Monday, I hope. Okay. So, is there any way you can look over the last exam? Yeah. Okay, so I need to... I've lost my mouse. All right, this happens on this terminal. I'm going to make it so basically like next Tuesday, I will be in the office from 1 until like 4. And you can just, anyone who wants to drop by can drop by between 1 and 4 and have a look at their midterm. I'll bring my iPad from home and my Kindle, and I'll steal a couple of the CCR iPads. So even if like 5 people come in, you can look at it. Did my wife drive me to school today in a Kia? I really hope not, because we don't own a Kia. So, I mean, that would have been a stolen car. That was not me, whoever you saw. And no, we own 2 cars, so I drove myself in a Dodge Grand Caravan, the greatest car ever made. Definitely not. That thing cost me nothing but money. So test is non-cumulative. It is socialization, deviance, crime, and globalization. And yes, I'll send out an email. But yeah, next Tuesday, basically 12:30 to 4, I will be around, and you can come in and take a look. All right. I need to remember to do this on 2 computers. I'm sorry. See, if I wasn't nice and recording this for other people, I could say, forget about it. Okay, where did we end off? We ended off here, I think. Well, we ended off on that last slide talking about, the globalization as the kind of shrinking of the world, principally the spread of capitalism to different parts of the globe. But also the spread of goods, services, culture across the world, but also the spread of inequality and worries that, particularly American culture is going to take over the rest of the world. Okay, I'm just making sure my microphone is working because I can't tell. It is not, because I didn't turn it on. There we go. Helps if you flick it on, right? Okay. Friday. Is it December yet? I really want it to be December yet. Okay. So, globalization. It's snowy and cold, and I'm like, yes, it is Christmas now. The course is over. Okay, so, talking about globalization, right? When we buy something today, right? When you get your iPhone or your sweater or your running shoes or pretty much anything that you own, today you're tying into what's called a global commodity chain, right? Now, if my video had played properly with audio, we've got to see what that global commodity chain looks like. But basically, in that video, it's really great. I'm sorry that the technology is not cooperating with me here. Stupid U of A. Buy some technology that works. Your tuition's high enough, and I pay enough for parking. You could buy one thing that works. But basically in that thing, they go through how a t-shirt is made, right? How the cotton's grown in Mississippi. That cotton is then shipped from Mississippi, through, different parts of Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Bangladesh, and then Colombia, where the t-shirts are assembled, right? The end product of most of the things that we buy today are all parts of these long chains of kind of commodities that get moved from place to place. And it's something like, when people have tracked how many miles, the chicken that you eat has traveled before you ever take a bite of it. It may have traveled, around the world twice, just because it's, sometimes slaughtered, then frozen, then butchered in China or somewhere else, and then frozen again and sent back, right? This is the kind of thing that happens in a global commodity chain. Capital goes to where costs are lowest. This is all, made possible by, technology, this is driven, globalization is driven essentially by 3 kind of forces. By technology, right? The technology which has made the world a smaller place, right? So, starting in a sense with steamships in, the 19th century, which made the world a much smaller place, right? It made it possible to travel much more quickly and not, reliant on things like the wind in order to get you places. And then, it's only accelerated since then. Things like the telegraph, right, invented in the 19th century, allowed instantaneous communicate, or more or less instantaneous communication between far-flung parts of the world. Then radio, television, the internet have all made it possible to communicate with different parts of the world basically instantaneously. And then in terms of travel, right, we had first steamships, and then we had airplanes, right? You climb into the sky sausage with wings, you sit in there for some period between 12 and 24 hours, and you can move from one part of the world to another, right? Want to go to completely the other side of the globe, right? You want to go to Beijing, you want to go to Moscow, a little harder now, used to be simpler. You want to go to Delhi, right? You can get in an airplane and fly there. So the world has become a much smaller place, right? And just think about what that would have been like in like 1850. You would have got on a steam, to go from, Toronto to, let's say you wanted to go to New Delhi, you would have got on a train to take you to probably Montreal or Halifax. From there, you would have got on a steamship that would take you, across the Atlantic, maybe through the Panama Canal, maybe around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern part of Africa. So your journey from Toronto to Delhi, would have been months, possibly, at very least a month, right? And now, right, you climb in the airplane, you're in Delhi in 24 hours. Okay, so technology has shrunk the world and made traveling and communicating across it much cheaper and easier. Politics, right? Important in determining kind of the level of globalization. I mean, increasingly, right, especially the United States, has tried to build a system of international law, or, how does Chrystia Freeland always put it? The rules-based international order, alliances, free trade agreements to kind of, bring the world together. Always on this theory that comes out of Washington called the Washington Consensus, that basically the more economically integrated the world is, the fewer conflicts there should be between, in the world. Now, obviously, this feels like it has broken down relatively recently. Thomas Friedman, this columnist at the New York Times, used to have this theory that no two countries that have a McDonald's have ever fought a war. And that was true until Ukraine and Russia went to war, both of which had McDonald's. Russia no longer has them. But, that theory kind of went out the window. But this idea is like, get the world more sorry, I have to slow down. Get the world more integrated, and everything will the world will get better and better. Everyone will live happier and happier, and there will be less conflict. Now, the few countries that sort of, were the rogue states in the world tended to be those with the lowest levels of global integration, right? So places like North Korea, which would stir up trouble with, launching nuclear missiles, or missiles that could be nuclear, ballistic missiles, over into the Sea of Japan. Iran, right, causing trouble in the Middle East, supporting groups in Yemen and groups like Hamas and these sorts of things, right? And then, a few other places like Venezuela that were relatively unconnected, right? These were, the countries that were politically isolated from the global community. So, people like Trudeau and Biden and Chrystia Freeland could talk about a rules-based international order. Okay, but probably the single biggest driving force in globalization really is economics, right? And basically, industrial capitalism from around the 1970s forward, has always wanted a couple of things, right? New markets, higher profits, and lower labor costs. And it's with the opening up of China at the end of the 1970s, famously, President Richard Nixon goes to China in the 1970s. I forget the exact years. Basically trying to open up China to the rest of the world, partially because he knows the Chinese and the Russians, or the Soviets at the time, are fighting, and he wants to kind of scare the Soviets into signing a arms treaty, which actually works. But it leads to China opening up and opening this huge labor pool of cheap labor to global capitalism, right? Capitalist competition, and especially the search for profit, more and more profit, which can come from things like new markets, so places like China, India, Russia, again, until recently, Although apparently you can still buy an iPhone or pretty much any product you want in Russia with very little trouble. There's sanctions in name only. All of these are huge markets that have opened up. So capitalism seeks more people to buy their stuff, cheaper ways to make it, and therefore higher profits. And this is probably the single biggest thing that's driven globalization, right? As places have gotten more expensive, global capital moves its operations to different places, opening them up as markets and also accessing lower labor costs. Okay, yeah, sorry, I went forward on one, but not the other. I hate this so much. All right, I will write a stern letter to ISD later complaining about this. All right, so transportation and globalization. And I know my connectors work because I was using them an hour ago in my other class and they worked fine. So it's this. Basically innovations in transportation have shrunk the world, right? They've made global cultural and material exchanges possible because, of their speed. One of the big things, and again, this is in the video, which unfortunately we didn't watch because of stupid computer stuff, the shipping container, right? The innovation of the shipping container and the massive ships that carry shipping containers across the globe, right, across the world's oceans, has been one of the things that's been truly transformative in terms of global trade. Before the shipping container, shipping used to be a giant pain in the butt. But once you have the shipping container, it gets very easy to move things first by boat and then by rail. And so, the shipping container on these massive, massive ships, like some of the biggest ships that we've ever built in human history are all basically shipping plastic McDonald's toys from a factory in Bangladesh to here, or Taiwan or China or wherever they're made. As it improves, right, the cultural interaction, as like the speed gets bigger, as there's been more flights, more aircraft flying, more flights connecting places, there's been more and more intense and deep cultural interactions, right? And so you have a period now where, people will go, what's the stereotypical thing that people do after they graduate from university, right? They go backpacking in Europe or Southeast Asia, right? They go to Thailand, they go to Bali. Actually, my South Asian geography sucks, apparently, now that I think about it. I'm like, what else is in Southeast Asia? Only like 2/3 of the world's population, and I can't think of 3 countries. Great, good job, right? Indonesia, Thailand. I'm just having a mental breakdown. I'm like, I know other countries there. Like, I know the Philippines is kind of in there too, Japan. I don't know. All right, enough. My geography sucks, apparently. New Guinea. And Old Guinea. No, Old Guinea somewhere else. Anyway, like I said, apparently I know Southeast Asia very well. Okay, so anyway, right, as it's become more possible to travel, we have deeper cultural interactions, more people moving from different parts of the world, right? More tourism, certainly, but more migration too, right? And so, even a place like Canada or the United States, we have this great mix of cultures coming in so that we have, all sorts of cultures represented just in this classroom, but through a city like Edmonton, a frozen wasteland. Why anyone would want to move here always baffles me a little. But, I suppose the economic opportunity and amazing lifestyle maybe is it. Also, it's cold outside, which makes me snarly. But, right, we now have this kind of melting pot or mosaic of these cultures where we've had deep connections with them so that we can, be exposed to movies from Bollywood, right? Indian movies, food from all over the world. I'm going out for Thai food with one of my friends later today. It's going to be awesome. I love Thai food. And, just this whole kind of deep integration of the world that wouldn't have been possible in the past. Okay. Georgia had McDonald's before Russia fought them. Good to know. I had forgotten about the very brief Russia-Georgia war. Okay, let me clear this off. Oh, okay, I can clear them on my laptop. Interesting, okay. All right. Yeah, so basically what I would say, I sadly already got ahead of myself on this slide as well. Global electronic communication has made the world a much more manageable place too, and allowed kind of large corporations to, say like Apple, be centered in California, but control operations across the globe, right? Now, this is the culmination of a very long process, right? That starts in, basically with the invention of the telegraph, right? Telegraph invented in 1832 by Samuel Morse. And basically, prior to that, you could only get information as fast as a person could carry a physical piece of paper, right? Or other medium of communication, right? To get information from London to Toronto, you had to go by ship across the Atlantic to Halifax or Montreal, then by foot, horse, or train to Toronto. It took time. The telegraph made this pretty much instantaneous, right? Which is why, the British, as soon as they saw the technology, they started laying these big undersea cables stretching, across the Atlantic first, and then all the way, from Britain to India, so they could control their far-flung empire, right? And basically, it made it possible for them to much more carefully control the British Empire at the end of the 19th and through the 20th century, because you could communicate quickly with the center, right? You could communicate with the capital, and Queen Victoria could tell you what you were supposed to do with those uppity Indians from India, right? And these sorts of things, right? So communication made things faster. And, as we've gotten into satellite communications, it's now possible to administer massive corporations centered in places like Europe and the United States, literally from those places, never having to travel, because you can monitor operations in those places, through something like Zoom now, but the telephone before, and all of these sorts of things. Radio, television, and films also allowed a much more direct transfer of culture, and we've seen the proliferation of things like Hollywood across the globe, right? So it's not uncommon, say, that if you went to, Beirut, right, you would see the same movies that are in the cinema in Edmonton, and you would probably hear Taylor Swift on the radio as well, right? Because that's how the world has kind of shrunk. McLuhan, right, Marshall McLuhan, the semi-insane University of Toronto, I say this because his work is incomprehensible. And I know I've tried to comprehend it, and it just does not work. But Marshall McLuhan, right, held up as one of the kind of great sages of the early electronic media age, called what was happening because of these connections, the transformation of the world into a global village, right? And things like, the Olympics and the World Cup kind of speak to that, because people all over the globe are watching them all at once and cheering for their teams, and all of those things, no matter where it takes place. Okay. Okay. The internet, obviously, I think, is the culmination, and the internet is interesting in a lot of ways for being what you might call a medium of mediums, right? The internet sort of has subsumed all of the other mediums. So, television, radio, film, right? Everything, books, everything now is kind of on the internet, right? And so the internet has become this kind of massive network of all the other kind of media. It's a global digital network. We all know what the internet is. And it's enabled, though, new forms of cultural production and exchange. I just saw the most interesting video today, and I was like, where am I going to talk about this? And I've decided to talk about it now. Apparently, in both LA and in places like Indonesia, they have these things that are called influencer factories, right? Where basically they are these big sets where they set up, like some influencer, it looks like their bedroom in the background. That's just like a box inside this factory where they're trying to produce the next influencer. And there are these massive internet corporations that are trying to produce influencers, right? So we went from this period, in the past where it used to be that, in order to make television, in order to make radio or music, in order to make films, you had to go through these massive corporations. Today, right, obviously the goal is, or what's happened since YouTube in particular came around, I guess Instagram too, is people have been able to produce their own content and become kind of media stars and exchange culture themselves. But because capitalism is what it is, now basically they're trying to sign people to contracts and turn people into influencers, basically by pushing them through these kind of influencer channels, right? So the next time you see some influencer kind of blowing up and, potentially connecting with other influencers, you might be looking at this new way of cultural production, which is trying to, sell you products and get you hooked on some influencer based on some corporation thinking that's what you like. So I know Mr. Beast is probably the example because he's entirely self-made-ish, probably. But the next generation of them looks like they're going to be factory produced. Yeah, there was a big argument. So this is a kind of weird argument from the early kind of days of the internet. There was an argument that, what we should do is try to get as many places in the world connected to the internet so they would all have free speech. And therefore liberalism, right, in that classical sense of liberalism, political and economic liberalism, would flourish because of the internet. Some argued this. All of those people now kind of look like they have egg on their face because that hasn't quite worked out. But, there was this great hope with the internet that would be this great force for democracy and political liberalism. In fact, it's been a great force for propaganda and cat memes and also health misinformation. So good times, for Vladimir Putin to, influence elections. I don't actually buy that as much anyway. Okay. And the other thing about the internet too is it's not even, right? If you look at the percentage of people in the globe that use the internet, it's mostly concentrated in the wealthier, more developed countries, right? So the West, United States, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, Australia, Western Europe, and then, basically China, Russia, and a little bit in India, and a lot of the rest of the world remains sort of disconnected from the internet in major ways. Certainly not high-speed internet. Do I think we'll ever get rid of paper books altogether? Does this unit cover anything related to global pandemics like COVID? No, because the textbook was written before. The new edition will. I talked to Lisa about it. So there's a whole bunch of cool stuff in the 8th edition, but I haven't integrated it yet because I'm not allowed. So no, we're not going to cover anything on global pandemics just yet. Do I think we'll ever get rid of paper books? I really hope not, because having a bunch of books on a shelf in my office, I think makes me look smarter. And just having my Kindle sitting there tilted on the big bookshelf empty, other than a bunch of knickknacks that I have in my office, wouldn't look as cool. So I hope not. I doubt it altogether. There seems to be a limit to how much people want to use ebooks. People still like having real books for some reason. I like ebooks because I buy a lot of books. And at one point my wife was like, you can't buy any more books. You have too many. And I got around this. They take up too much space physically because we've moved a bunch and they're heavy. So I discovered a workaround. I can get as many ebooks as I want and they weigh nothing. So I defeated my wife in the battle of stop buying so many books. Now, if only I read them all, that would be a good thing. Okay. Just double check something here. How are we doing? Oh, I just want to see how many slides we have going here. All right. So 33, and I'm on 13. Oh no, my example is not going to work because I have no sound, and I'm sad. Okay. We would all have gotten to listen to the song from Frozen. It would have been awesome. I'm sure you're not sick of that song at all after, a decade and a half. Okay, so transnational corporations, right? One of the big agents in globalization have been transnational, sometimes also called multinational or international corporations. Okay, so transnational corporations typically are corporations that operate in a bunch of different countries, right? So they operate in a whole bunch of different places. They sell their goods, in a whole bunch of different places, but they're typically, headquartered in a very few select places. So typically the United States, right? Most of them are the United States, some in Western Europe, France, Germany, Britain, typically, although you have a few in Italy and Spain as well. China, increasingly, right? You got your Huawei's and companies like that. But mostly that's where most of the transnational corporations come from. They account for a disproportionate amount of global profits, right, and global wealth kind of generation and asset value. I think it's just like 3 American corporations, Apple, Microsoft, and Google, are all worth over $1 trillion, and are basically, three of the, they're basically companies that have more valuation than the economy of most nation states, right? Including some of the G7 or G20 countries. So these are massive, massive, massive actors, right? Disney used to be big and then not so much. They screwed up the MCU and Star Wars, and then they lost all their value, to me. And their stock value too. Stupid MCU movies that are bad, and too many series that I can't physically keep track of, and I'm like, what is this show? Who is this character? I have no idea anymore, and I gave up. Okay, so the multinational corporations, transnational corporations, they are a big deal. Some of them are as powerful as nation states in a lot of ways, and they can influence national policy in major ways. Increasingly, they differ from traditional corporations in a bunch of ways, right? Increasingly, they depend on foreign labor and production. Think about Apple. Apple, makes very little in the United States, right? Your phone says designed in the United States, made by slave labor in China. It might not say that last part, but it says made in China, right? Designed in California, made in China in factories that are so appalling in their conditions that they have nets around the windows so people don't fling themselves out and commit suicide. That might have been kind of long to put on the back of the phone, so it just says made in China. Lots of foreign labor and foreign production because it's cheap, right? And you can think of Nike. Nike's the same, right? I think most corporations now do most of their production outside of the major economies. Increasingly emphasize skills in advanced design, technology, and management, right? So increasing, especially in their kind of American operations, right? These are really high-tech companies. Increasingly dependent on world markets, right? So a lot of the profits for a lot of these corporations now come from outside the West or the kind of the so-called developed nations. This is definitely the case for, Hollywood. Hollywood Films had all of these big multinational corporations, and a lot of their profits, came from three markets: China, India, and Russia. It's been a rough couple of years for those because, they stopped selling movies in Russia completely. China has clamped down on Hollywood films in major ways. And India, probably still a big market. But of the three, I think it's one of the poorest per capita. So increasingly dependent on world markets. Same for Apple, Coca-Cola, right? Coca-Cola makes most of its profit outside the United States in places like Mexico. A huge profit center for Coca-Cola, weirdly enough. Dependent on massive advertising campaigns of the global kind. And increasingly independent or autonomous from national governments in ways that are distressing. A lot of big companies, for example, move money around the world so that they don't have to pay tax. And so for a long time, and I think it's still the case, like Microsoft, Google, and Apple, their European operations were all headquartered in Ireland because Ireland, I actually have friends who work for Google in Ireland, funnily enough. But because Ireland basically made them pay no tax, so as long as they parked their money in Irish banks, they were basically operating tax-free within the EU. Now the EU cracked down on this, right? But they're increasingly kind of hard to manage for national governments because they span the globe and they have so much financial power, right? Microsoft or Google or Apple or ExxonMobil or Disney, right? They all have powerful lobbyists in places like Washington, D.C. that can change laws. And not for nothing, Disney has managed to change copyright laws globally for many years to protect their assets like Winnie the Pooh and Mickey Mouse from ever exiting copyright and becoming public domain, right? I think Winnie the Pooh finally entered the public domain a few years ago, and then a very disturbing film, low-budget film called Pooh, Blood and Honey came out. If I could ever get audio working, I'll show you the trailer one time. Oh, and we can't listen to the Frozen song. But if we could listen to the Frozen song, you would see that it's in 25 languages, illustrating how much of the world is kind of subsumed by Disney and its Magic Kingdom. Okay. So, how am I doing for time? I am doing amazing. I've gotten through so many slides. We're totally going to get this unit done on Monday. The schedule works and isn't broken at all. All right. So, couple of terms here that you should remember, right? Definitely think about these. The last one's going to screw you up, but I'll do my best to explain it to you. All right, so McDonald'sization, right? This has been one of the terms This comes from a guy named Roland Robertson when he was writing about, that's globalization. McDonaldization, I can't remember who actually came up with that term. McDonaldization basically is a form of rationalization, right? At a kind of global scale. So think about it, right? We talked about Weber, right? When we talked about Weber, Weber talked about rationalization, the organization of things in society to make them as efficient as possible, right? So McDonaldization is basically taking systems that operate in one kind of market and moving them into other markets, right? So the classic example of this is McDonald's, which is why it's called McDonaldization. McDonald's is a highly rationally run business. And if you've ever, worked at a McDonald's or knew someone who worked at a McDonald's, I'm sorry. Also, it is a machine, right? Everybody has their role. The way that you produce a inedible cheeseburger smothered in too much sauce, which is still better than Burger King somehow. I don't know why. Honestly, we went down to the States this summer and we had to stop at a Burger King because it was the only thing around for whatever reason. There's a whole story, and I have never eaten food that bad. And I've been to many places with bad food, for instance, Paris. A little dig at French culture. Some very bad food in Paris, though, too. Worse than that, London. Oh, my God. Ugh. The English. I love the English, but their food is terrible. Anyway, I've never eaten anything worse than Burger King. Like, I took one bite and I'm like, okay, I guess we'll call this my day to do intermittent fasting. I ain't eating this shit. But anyway, McDonald's, a little color for you there. Also, don't eat at Burger King so we can put it out of business forever. That's my eat at Burger Baron, a far less edible but also local business. Okay, so McDonaldization, right? Basically what McDonald's did as it reached its tentacles out into the world is it brought its system of doing things with it, right? So it brought this highly rationalized way of producing a semi-edible burger into, Europe first, and then South America, Russia, China, Israel, everywhere that you could possibly imagine a McDonald's being, right? So basically, McDonaldization has come to stand for the global spread of values associated with the United States and its business culture, right? So that you copy the kind of business culture of these American chains, right? And every aspect of that rationalized business practice gets moved along with the brand, right? So Coke is produced in the same way in India as it is in the United States. McDonald's is made the same way, fundamentally, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as it is in Beijing. Right? It all goes through this very rationalized process. And this is how capitalism works and achieves economies of scale by moving not just, the same products everywhere, but the same ways, highly efficient ways of doing things. Okay. Glocalization. Glocalization is a little bit different. This is from Roland Robertson, who wrote about how Japanese companies were really good about this kind of thing. Basically, glocalization is the simultaneous homogenization of some aspects of life and the strengthening of some local differences under globalization. Again, McDonald's is an interesting example of this, right? One of the things that McDonald's does when it moves into a market, right, is it comes up with products that are going to be appealing just in that market that might fill either a niche or, help in some cultural way for McDonald's to spread. So, I've got up on the screen here the McFalafel from Israel, right? As falafel is a cultural food in Israel, but you see it like if you go to the Maritimes, right? You've got occasionally the McLobster, which is terrible. It's better than a Big Mac, but nevertheless. Anyway, my opinion of the McLobster notwithstanding, it's a tasty maritime treat for you and I. Hopefully you. But they come up with kind of local variations on their kind of global brand, right? So they're global, but they have this local kind of element, right? So you might have, different flavors of Crush or Fanta in different places that appeal to that specific market, right? Something, basically where you're taking your global brand, moving it to another place, and not changing everything, but adding sort of a local flavor to some things, right? McDonald's serves different foods in different countries based on kind of culture, right? And then regionalization, this is the one that always screws people up. Basically, this is the argument that the world increasingly is being broken up into sort of regional blocks, right? And often regional blocks that are competing against each other economically, politically, and culturally. And this, I think, fundamentally comes from Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, right, where Huntington sort of posited that, you know, the era of globalization would end up breaking down into sort of these blocks competing against each other across kind of cultural lines. Now, strangely enough, he was derided at the time, but for instance, he predicted that eventually there would be a war in which Russia tried to take over. He wrote this in like the 1990s, where Russia would try to take over the eastern part of Ukraine, which was Orthodox, and make it part of Russia. Got that one right. But also that the Islamic world would kind of coalesce, especially against Israel. Not a particularly hard thing to predict, I think. But there would be these kinds of regional blocks. Latin American countries would band together regionally because they share a lot of cultural markers and kind of market their own things to the rest of the world. Things like telenovelas, things that they're good at producing. I can't think of any other Latin American products. I'm a terrible person. Asia, especially led by China, would have this kind of block of countries that all kind of move together, and so on and so forth. That basically the world would end up split into these different regional kind of blocks. All right, I still have 10 minutes. I know you can pack up, but I'd rather you didn't. Oops, I have these on a second slide. Oh, but I have this row of horrors. I don't know what the crispy Chinese is or what's in it. I hope it's not Chinese people, but, crispy Chinese. These are different McDonald's products from around the world. The paneer salsa wrap, the McVeggie, the McAloo tiki, which sounds actually pretty good, although McDonald's can ruin everything. I'm assuming the pizza McPuff comes from hell. I don't know. Okay. I'm kidding, of course. All right. So, one of the complaints with globalization all the time has been that, it's very unequal, that the wealthy countries in the world have benefited enormously from the growth of global capitalism, the access to cheap labor, where a lot of other people have actually not benefited at all, right? So, extreme poverty, right? That a lot of people still live in extreme poverty, and how is it defined by the United Nations? As about $2 a day, what's called purchasing power parity, which is this really, really weird measure. But it basically takes a basket of goods, sort of the essentials of life, like bread, eggs, cheese, and a few other things, and says how much would it cost to purchase these things, in another country, right? Because different places have lower prices. So the good news about global poverty or extreme poverty in the world is since about 1990, more than 1 billion people have moved out of extreme poverty into kind of increasingly a global middle class. The extreme poverty has dropped from about 36% of the global population in 1990 to about 8% in 2019. Now it rose a little bit again after COVID, because the world economy went through some convulsions, but it's still a lot better than it was in 1990. All right. Okay, I've heard let it go in Russian, and I cannot remember the words. I think let it go is like отпусти и забудь, like let go and forget. But that's as much as you're going to get out of me. I keep mentioning Russia. Am I Russian? I am not Russian. My Ukrainian grandmother would find that offensive. She's dead, so you can say whatever you want. COVID got her. What am I going to say? But I'm probably a Russophile. I spent half a year living in St. Petersburg, a student exchange. So, yeah. Anyway, I like Russia mostly. A beer-flavored milkshake at McDonald's in Finland. I missed that when I was in Helsinki. How did I miss that? Maybe that was new. I just remember all the garbages said Kiitos, and it took us a while to figure out that Kiitos meant thank you, because we're stupid. All right, hang on. No. I eat my mom's food, and anything else will taste good. Ooh, that's a burn. Okay. All right. Let's do a couple more slides here. Oh, hang on. You're asking about what's my favorite McDonald's order? Weirdly, the junior chicken. because it's cheap and smothered in mayonnaise, so it doesn't taste awful. Okay, and kind of spicy. It's weird. All right. So, yeah. How much time do I have left? I know people are packing up. I just want to make sure. According to Brookings, so this is information from the Brookings Institution, which is an American think tank. Global poverty, the good news about it is we passed an important threshold in September 2018. For the first time, the majority of humankind was no longer poor or vulnerable to falling into poverty. This changed a little, so it dipped during COVID. A lot of people fell back into this vulnerable and poor kind of area, but it has roared back ahead, right, with global growth picking back up. And so today, we have more people in the middle class and who are rich than are poor or at risk of falling or vulnerable to falling into poverty. So the world, basically since 1990 has fundamentally changed. Now, most of that change has come in two places, India and China, but the whole story is generally getting better. Okay. All right, we'll do, I keep checking the time because usually I have the time there. Globalization, yeah, far from universally welcome. As you probably can remember, there have been lots of anti-globalization movements, and some of them have kind of passed away now. And there's a lot of current ones. A lot of it now is kind of encapsulated by the climate change movement, right? The movement to, battle climate change. Some of them are, some are extremely violent. Some are non-violent. Probably the biggest example of the violent ones are, I think it was from 1998, the World Trade Organization had a meeting in Seattle, and anti-globalization, the World Trade Organization is a big kind of international body led by the US and Europe that kind of organizes and tries to set rules for global trade. And basically they had a big meeting in Seattle in the 90s, and it ended in what's called the Battle for Seattle, where basically protesters ransacked downtown Seattle. They broke into the Nike store. They broke all the windows at every Starbucks, and kind of trashed downtown as this kind of anti-globalization protest. But you definitely have non-violent ones, right? Things like the Just Stop Oil protests are basically a form of anti-globalization kind of protest around energy, and they'll splash paint or tomato soup on famous works of art or glue their hands to the floor, which sounds counterproductive. I'm like, just leave them there. Once they're glued to the floor, what else could they do? Just make a mess, I guess. They're going to come to regret it quite a bit, and everyone else who has to go around them will as well, once they start getting smelly. Now I've lost my train of thought. Or the guys who sit in traffic, right? These are kind of non-violent forms of protest against forms of globalization. And some only reject the excesses of globalization and are especially focused on things like global inequality, while others, want to undo globalization entirely, seeing especially the pollution and labor exploitation that comes from it as ultimately negative. Oh, there's no way I can do this in 2 minutes. All right, let's call her quits, because I can't do a short history of globalization in 2 minutes. I will have 13 slides to get through on Monday, which I 100% can do, especially if I have no question slides, which makes things a lot faster. All right, so we'll go through that on Monday. We'll get done, and that'll be it for our content. It'll be fun. All right, now I am going to leave. Let's disconnect. Oopsie.